At exactly 4:44 in the morning, Elias Thorne was jolted awake not by an alarm, but by the heavy metallic thud of an object hitting his pillow. He sat up abruptly, his heart hammering against his ribs in the suffocating darkness of his bedroom. In the pale moonlight filtering through the pine trees, he saw the silhouette of his black cat, Orion, standing over him. The cat's copper eyes glowed with an intensity that bordered on human desperation. As Elias reached for the bedside lamp, he expected to find a dead mouse or a bird. But the sight that greeted him made his blood turn to ice. There, resting on his pillow, was a child's silver bracelet, tarnished and bent as if it had been crushed under a great weight. Orion didn't meow or purr for attention. He simply stood there, his chest heaving with a frantic, shallow rhythm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Before Elias could utter a word, the cat leaped from the bed and ran toward the door, stopping only to look back with a gaze so piercing it felt like a command. Elias followed him downstairs to the woodworking shop, where the air was thick with the scent of cedar and old sawdust. In the corner of the room, Orion began a violent ritual. He stood on his hind legs and began clawing frantically at an old forestry map pinned to the wall. His claws ripped through the heavy paper, specifically shredding the area marked as the Black Forest, a treacherous zone of limestone caves and vertical drops. The sound of claws on wood and paper was deafening in the silence of the mountain morning. It wasn't the behavior of a cat looking for a treat. It was the behavior of a creature possessed by a singular, terrifying purpose. For 14 days, this exact sequence had repeated. Each time, Orion returned from the forest with a piece of the human world, and each time, he ended his journey at that map, crying out in a voice that sounded like a mourning widow. Elias looked down at Orion's paws and realized they were caked in dried mud and stained with fresh blood. The cat was digging for something, and whatever it was consuming his very soul. Elias Thorne had moved to the jagged peaks of Blackwood Ridge to bury his own history. After losing his wife in a sudden car accident 2 years prior, the noise of the city felt like a constant assault on his grief. He retreated to this cabin to work with his hands, finding a strange peace in the grain of the wood and the predictability of the seasons. He was a man who preferred the company of shadows, which is why he felt such a connection to the black cat he found during a devastating mudslide 4 months ago. He had found the animal trapped under a fallen hemlock tree, nearly drowned and shivering so violently that Elias thought its heart would stop. He had carried the wet, pathetic M, lung the ball of fur inside, dried him with a warm towel, and fed him warm milk with a dropper for 3 days. He named him Orion, after the great hunter in the stars, because even in his weakest state, the cat had a regal, untouchable dignity. For months, they lived in a silent partnership. Orion was a ghost in the house, a shadow that moved between the rafters, never seeking affection but always present. But as the first frost of winter hardened the ground, Orion's personality shifted. He became obsessed with the woods at night. Elias thought it was just the call of the wild, but the arrival of the silver bracelet changed everything. It wasn't just any jewelry. It was a distinctive piece of silver craft that matched the description of a girl named Lily who had vanished 3 years ago. Her disappearance was the town's greatest tragedy, a wound that had never healed because no body was ever found. As Elias held the cold metal, he realized the cat he had saved might be the only witness to a story that started long before he arrived at the ridge. The behavior grew more disturbing with each passing day. After the bracelet came a scrap of pink lace, then a tiny mud-caked doll's shoe. Each morning, Orion arrived at 4:44, dropped the item, and began his desperate assault on the map. Elias tried to keep him inside, locking the cat door and boarding up the windows in the shop. The result was heartbreaking. Orion didn't just meow to get out. He threw his entire 15-pound body against the door until his shoulders were bruised. He howled with a frequency that sounded like a human scream, a sound that echoed through the valley and kept Elias awake, trembling under his covers. Elias began to wonder if he was living with a monster or a miracle. He consulted online forums, reading about feline displacement or predatory confusion, but none of it fit. A cat doesn't bring back silver and lace. They bring back things they can eat. His neighbors in the small town below whispered about mountain madness, a condition where the isolation of the forest begins to warp the minds of both men and beasts. Elias felt himself slipping into that madness, his shop no longer a place of craft but a shrine to whatever Orion was digging up in the dark. Every time Elias approached the cat to comfort him, Orion would retreat, his ears flattened and his eyes fixed on the forest. He refused to eat the expensive salmon Elias bought, ignoring the bowls of fresh water. He was wasting away, his ribs becoming prominent under his black fur, yet he seemed to possess a supernatural energy that drove him back into the woods the moment the sun went down. The obsession wasn't just in the cat's mind. It was etched into his physical being. Elias realized that if he didn't find an answer soon, the cat would literally work himself to death. He tried to map out the items Orion brought back, placing them in a row on his workbench. A bracelet, a ribbon, a shoe, a button. They were all weathered, aged by years of exposure to the elements, yet they appeared in the shop fresh with the smell of wet earth and pine resin. Alias felt a heavy weight in his chest. He was a restorer of wood, a man who brought dead things back to life. Yet he felt completely powerless to help the one creature that had stood by him in his own dark times. He knew he had to act, but the forest at night was a maze of death, and he was a man who had already lost too much to risk his life for a mystery. One night, the tension reached a breaking point. Elias was awakened by a sound like a gunshot. He rushed to the workshop to find that Orion had managed to knock a heavy iron lantern off a shelf, shattering the glass and narrowly missing his own head. The cat was standing in the middle of the broken glass, his paws bleeding, but he wasn't looking at his wounds. He was looking at Elias, and for the first time, he let out a low, mournful trill that sounded like a name. It was then that Elias decided he couldn't do this alone. He needed a professional to tell him if his cat was losing his mind or if he was trying to save someone else's. But on the 17th night, the infrared camera he had installed in the corner of the shop finally captured why Orion always looked toward the staircase before leaving. When Elias played back the footage at 3:06 in the morning, his hands went cold. On the screen, Orion wasn't just looking at the stairs. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at a height of about 3 feet off the ground, his tail twitching in a rhythm that looked like he was being petted by an invisible hand. When Elias zoomed in, he saw the cat's fur ripple along his spine as if a finger were tracing the line of his back. Before we continue with the terrifying discovery at the vet's office, if you find yourself moved by the mysterious and unbreakable bonds between humans and animals, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more of these incredible, heart-touching stories to life. Now, let's return to Elias and the secret Orion was buried under. The next morning, Elias drove 3 hours to the nearest high-end veterinary clinic. He didn't go to the local vet. He went to Dr. Julianne Reed, a specialist known for dealing with trauma in working animals. He brought Orion in a reinforced carrier, along with a small box containing the items the cat had found. Orion was eerily silent during the trip, his eyes fixed on the passing trees, his body rigid. When they arrived, Elias explained everything: the timing, the human artifacts, the map, and the chilling footage from the infrared camera. Dr. Reed was a woman of science, but she had lived in the mountains long enough to know that logic didn't always cover the things that happened under the canopy of the pines. She began a thorough examination of Orion, checking his vitals and his reflexes. When she reached his paws, she stopped. She pulled out a magnifying lamp and spent 10 minutes examining the underside of his claws. Her face grew pale, and she signaled for her assistant to bring a collection kit. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm not seeing normal dirt here. These are microscopic fibers of pink cotton and something else, calcium deposits that look like bone fragments." She refused to let Elias take Orion home. "I need to run a full forensic panel on these samples," she insisted. "This isn't a behavioral issue. This cat has been digging through a very specific type of environment, a high-acidity soil mixed with limestone dust, that only exists in the deep cave systems of the Black Forest." Elias felt a wave of nausea hit him. "Are you saying he's finding remains?" Dr. Reed didn't answer immediately. She just looked at Orion, who was staring at the door of the exam room with a level of focus that was truly haunting. "I think your cat is trying to finish a job he started 3 years ago," she finally said. 2 days later, the preliminary results came back, and they sent a shockwave through the small community. The DNA from the fabric fibers matched the clothing worn by Lily, the missing girl. The silver bracelet was confirmed by her parents as a family heirloom she had been wearing the day she vanished. But the most shocking part was the bone fragments. They weren't Lily's. They were the remains of small forest animals: rabbits, squirrels, and birds. Dr. Reed sat Elias down in her office, her hands trembling as she held the report. "Elias, look at the mime on the wear and tear on these bone fragments," she said, pointing to a slide. "They weren't chewed by a predator. They were meticulously placed. I believe Orion has been hunting and bringing food to that cave for 3 years. He wasn't just guarding the site, he was trying to keep someone alive." Elias felt the room spin. "But Lily has been gone for 3 years. No child could survive that." Dr. Reed nodded sadly. "We know that. But Orion doesn't. Or rather, he couldn't accept it. He stayed in that cave, bringing his prey to her side every single day, waiting for her to wake up." The veterinarian explained that the mudslide 4 months ago must have partially collapsed the entrance to the cave where Orion had lived with his lost owner. When Elias rescued the cat, he had inadvertently separated Orion from his vigil. For 4 months, Orion had been trying to get back, but the shifting earth had hidden the entrance. The items he was bringing back now were things he had managed to dig out of the debris as he fought to reach her one last time. He wanted Elias to help him because he knew his own strength was failing. He was an old warrior, and he was running out of time to bring his girl home. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. He thought about the cat's cries at 4:44 a.m., the time of the original accident. He thought about the infrared footage. Orion wasn't seeing a ghost. He was remembering the touch of the only person who had ever truly owned his heart. Elias realized that his own grief, as deep as it was, paled in comparison to the 3-year-old vigil of a 15-pound cat who refused to let death have the final word. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant facing the darkness he had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Elias called the local authorities, but he knew they wouldn't be able to find the exact spot in the vastness of the Black Forest. He needed Orion. He went back to the clinic and demanded that Dr. Reed release the cat. He's the only one who knows where she is, Elias argued. If we don't go now, the winter snow will seal that cave forever. Dr. Reed looked at Orion, who had begun to pace his small kennel with a renewed, desperate energy. She opened the door, and the cat leaped straight into Elias's arms, burying his head against the man's chest in a rare display of vulnerability. They returned to the cabin as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Elias geared up with a heavy pack, ropes, and a high-powered flashlight. He opened the workshop door and looked at Orion. "Show me," he said. The cat didn't hesitate. He bolted into the woods, his black fur disappearing into the shadows. Elias followed, his breath visible in the freezing air, his boots crunching through the frozen needles. They climbed higher than Elias had ever ventured, moving deep into the heart of the limestone cliffs where the trees grew thick, and the wind sounded like a choir of the lost. After hours of trekking, Orion stopped before a jagged fissure in the rock, nearly hidden by a fallen slab of granite. The cat began to dig, his paws moving with a feverish intensity. Elias moved the cat aside and used a crowbar to pry the rock away. As the opening widened, the smell of damp earth and something ancient wafted out. Elias shone his light into the darkness. The beam hit a small, hollow chamber. In the corner, resting on a bed of dry moss and surrounded by the gifts Orion had brought over the years, was a small, tattered pink dress and the quiet remains of a child who had simply fallen asleep in the cold. Elias fell to his knees in the dirt, the tears he had been holding back for years finally breaking free. He wasn't just crying for Lily. He was crying for the sheer, terrifying beauty of a love that didn't know how to quit. Orion walked into the cave, sat beside the remains, and let out one final, long purr. It was the sound of a debt paid, a promise kept, and a soul finally finding its rest. Elias stayed there for a long time, the cat's head resting on his knee, as the moonlight silvered the forest floor outside. The recovery of Lily's remains made national headlines, but Elias kept the details of Orion's vigil to himself and a few close friends. He didn't want the world to turn the cat's grief into a spectacle. The town held a memorial for the girl, and for the first time in 3 years, the heavy cloud of what if lifted from Blackwood Ridge. Lily's parents visited Elias, and when they saw Orion, they both broke down. They recognized him instantly as Midnight, the kitten they had given Lily on her 5th birthday. They asked to take him back, but when Orion saw them, he retreated behind Elias's legs, his eyes fixed on the man who had pulled him from the mud. Lily's father touched Elias's shoulder. "He's made his choice," the man said through tears. "He stayed with her until he could find someone to take over. I think he's found that person in you." Elias nodded, unable to speak. He realized that Orion had been a restorer too. He had restored a family's peace, a town's history, and a lonely man's ability to care about something other than his own sorrow. The cat stayed with Elias, but the morning rituals stopped. The cries at 4:44 a.m. were replaced by a quiet wait at the foot of the bed. 6 months later, as the first flowers of spring began to poke through the mountain soil, Elias was back in his shop. The map of the Black Forest had been replaced by a new, clean one, but the coordinate of the cave was marked with a small hand-carved silver star. Orion was lounging in a sunbeam on the workbench, his fur shiny and his weight restored. He no longer looked like a haunted hunter. He looked like a cat who had finally come home from a very long war. Elias still thought about his wife every day, but the pain no longer felt like a suffocating weight. It felt like the grain in a piece of fine wood, a part of the structure, something that added character and strength rather than just being a flaw. He looked at Orion and realized that the greatest gift the cat had given him wasn't the mystery or the resolution. It was the reminder that we are defined not by what we lose, but by what we are willing to protect until the very end. The local children sometimes passed by the cabin and pointed to the black cat in the window. They called him the guardian of the ridge, and they told stories about how he could see through the mountain itself. Elias just smiled and kept working. He knew the truth was much simpler and much more profound. Orion was just a friend who refused to let go, a tiny shadow that carried a massive light. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are told in silence, in the dirt of a cave, and in the persistent heart of a creature the world tried to ignore. Orion had taught Elias that even when everything is taken away, the spirit remains. He had taught him that loyalty isn't a duty, it's a sanctuary. And as the sun set over Blackwood Ridge, casting long purple shadows across the pines, Elias knew that neither of them would ever be truly alone again. The shop door remained unlocked now, a sign that the man inside was no longer afraid of what the world might bring. And the black cat remained by his side, a living testament to the fact that some bonds are stronger than time, stronger than the mountains, and even stronger than death itself. They had found their peace in each other, two survivors who had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, forever changed but finally whole. Oftentimes, love doesn't arrive with a grand gesture. It comes in the form of a small, persistent shadow, a steady gaze in the dark, and a heart that refuses to give up until the truth is finally brought into the light. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more stories of the incredible and unspoken bonds that connect us all. Thank you for being a part of this journey.